Hi, I'm Holly of Tuesday Associates, and today we're going to talk about GOTV. What is GOTV? It is getting your vote to the polls. Whether it's early voting or election day, you want to get your people out to vote. What kind of difference can it make? Well, it's been generally believed that it makes a 4 to 10% difference. Nowadays, it can make as much as a 20 to 30% difference in the turnout, and a turnout in your favor. So you want to have a good GOTV plan. You don't want to leave your election results up to fate. If you leave it up to fate, fate can be very cruel. So you want to make sure from day one, when you're writing your campaign plan, that you write in GOTV. And GOTV starts on day one, figuring out who you want to get out to vote for you. You want to win. That's why. Now, there are 8 crucial steps. There are 8 crucial elements in GOTV. The first one is money. Of course you need money. But when you're writing your overall campaign budget, you want to make sure that you put GOTV into your costs. You don't want to run out of money at the end and say, oh, we ran out of money, we couldn't do our GOTV program. What do you need the money for? Well, for your database, for the postcards we talked about during the last video. The next thing you need is manpower. You need to have volunteers, people that are willing to help you implement it. We're going to need people to drive people to the polls. We're going to need people to make phone calls. You need some manpower. You also need the voter identification plan. As we discussed in the last video, you need to have a plan, and it starts on day one of your voter identification, whether it's door knocking, phone surveys, or peer-to-peer texting. You got to have a game plan. Can't turn out people to vote if you don't know who they are. So you have to have a good voter identification plan. You will also need to know the rules. This is crucial. When does early voting start? When does it finish? Where does early voting happen? Is it a mail-in ballot? Do people need to show their ID to vote? You need to know all of these things before election day, while you're doing your GOTV plan. You also need a timeline. Putting onto that timeline, when does early voting start? You also need to put in the goals, like, for example, how many voters do I want to have identified before early voting starts? How many people do I want to turn out? So you need to have a timeline. You will also need to have a game plan for absentee or early voting. Most states are giving up absentee and going to early voting. You have to have a game plan. You cannot ignore early voting and say, I'll just do GOTV for election day. You have to have a game plan for absentee voting and early voting. You also need to have a social pressure strategy, and we'll get to that a little bit later. But you will need a social pressure. I'm not saying social media, I'm saying social pressure strategy. And the last thing you'll need is an election day game plan, which actually starts 72 hours before election day. Let's talk about your GOTV budget. This is critical. All too often, campaigns fail to put the money aside for a GOTV program at the end of the campaign. They run out of money. This is a huge mistake. You don't want to make this mistake. You're talking about not being able to increase turnout anywhere from 4 to 30%. And most campaigns are going to need that extra 4 to 30% at the polls. So you got to write into your campaign budget a GOTV budget. What are you going to need the money for? Well, you might need it for a voter database. Now, most parties, Republican or Democrat, will give you access to a voter database. But if not, you might have to go to a vendor to get a voter database. And this is critical. Remember the Romney campaign? His voter database failed on election day, and so he couldn't contact people. My suggestion is make sure that you check out your voter database before election day to make sure it doesn't fail. But you're going to need a voter database because you've got to know who you want to turn out on election day. The next thing you're going to need money for is your voter identification program. We talked in the last video about door knocking. Well, in that video, we talked about how you need palm cards. That costs money. And also, you were going to do a couple mailings associated with your door knocking. That costs money. Your phone surveys are going to cost money. I like to do a positive push poll, and use a vendor for that, that costs money. If you don't have the money for that, if you're doing robo surveys, that's going to cost money. So your voter identification program, which starts on day one, you're going to need money for that. You're also going to need money for phone banks, whether you're using volunteers or using paid phone banks to remind people to vote during early voting or election day. You're going to most likely need money for that. There are systems now that allow volunteers to automatically call voters in a quick fashion, so that all they have to do is they hang up the phone and they go to the next voter, it goes very quickly. That costs money. So your phone banking is going to cost money. You're going to need lawyers. All too often on elections, there's some kind of discrepancy that goes on and you need a lawyer. And you can't wait till election day or wait till early voting starts to hire a lawyer. You're going to need them right on hand, right then when it's happening. I remember one campaign where somebody walked out with a ballot box, and I was very thankful I had a lawyer on call that day, and we got the issue resolved, and somebody didn't walk away with a whole ballot box. So, but you need lawyers, and you don't want to skimp on that. You think you might be able to save, but you got to have a couple lawyers on hand, so that costs money. You're going to need money for social pressure mailings, and we will get to that, but you will need money for that. Texting system. 92% of the people read their text messages. It's a good way to remind people to vote, so you're going to need money for text messaging. You're also going to need money for social media advertising. Remember, you've spent a lot of time building up a lot of followers on Facebook. Well, you want to use that universe and you want to advertise to them about early voting and reminding them to vote on election day. So you're going to need money for that. These are the major items you're going to need money for your GOTV plan. On your GOTV plan, you need to know the rules in advance. And you need to start finding out on day one. There's nothing worse than finding out when early voting starts on October 1st and finding out on September 30th. You want to find out this information from day one and put it into your campaign plan. What do you need to know for rules? Does your district absentee vote or do they early vote? If they early vote, do they early vote via the mail or do they early vote in person? How many locations are there? Can you poll check? What are the rules for poll checking? Can you sign hold outside of early voting if a lot of people are early voting? Can you sign hold out? How close can you be for sign holding on election day? Some states allow people almost to walk into the polling place with the voter to try to convince them to vote your way. These are crucial things you need to know beforehand. Is an ID required for a person to vote? So your poll checkers, when they are watching that, do they need to watch for these IDs to make sure they're good? Or do they not require ID? Or if there's a challenge on somebody being that voter, what are the rules for challenging that voter or challenging that vote? You need to know all of this before election day, even before early voting starts. The other thing you need to know is, are robocalls allowed? Now, some states are outlawing robocalls. So if your plan was to contact voters via robocalls because you don't have enough volunteers, then you better figure out something else if robocalls are outlawed in your state. Other things you need to know. Look, as a Republican, I like to advertise on conservative talk radio shows to remind our voters to get out. But some radio stations won't take commercials on election day. So you better figure out whether they can or cannot take those commercials on election day. Knowing the rules beforehand is essential for you to have a good GOTV plan. I can't tell you how many people forget and don't do this on day one. Start on day one knowing the rules for your GOTV. The next essential item in your GOTV plan is early voting. You need to have a program. You don't want to ignore early voting and say, well, I'm just going to do GOTV for election day. Using early voting can help increase your overall turnout, so you can't ignore it. Now, people wonder what's the difference between absentee voting and early voting. Absentee voting usually requires an excuse, for such as you're going to be out of town or you are sick. Most states are getting away from that and going to early voting. Once you know the rules for early voting, you then want to obviously turn out your voters. Who do you want to encourage to vote? Well, the people that you've identified to vote. Obviously, you spent all that time door knocking, doing the phone surveys, doing the peer-to-peer text messaging. You want to turn those people out. But there are other people you want to turn out as well. Party loyalists. Remember how we talked about the 1 and 5s in the voter identification and door knocking list, getting that list? The 1s are Republicans, the 5s are Democrats. Well, if you're a Republican, you want to turn out all the 1s. You didn't have to door knock on them, but they are your people, so you want to turn them out to vote. So party loyalists, donors. All too often, people forget that their donors are basically identified votes. So you want to remind your donors to get out and vote. Your volunteers. And your volunteers that are working on Election Day, if they're going to be helping you out on Election Day, I require them all to early vote. Your campaign staff, make sure that they all early vote. There's nothing worse than losing volunteers, key volunteers, and key staff on Election Day because they have to go and vote. So you want to make sure your volunteers and your staff are early voting. Another key group to have early vote is your hometown. You're saying hometown, but I didn't identify them. Well, if you're running for state rep or state senator, most likely your hometown people are going to vote your way. Now, as a Republican, I'm not going to turn out my hometown people that are 5s and 4s, but if I haven't identified the 3s, 2s, and 1s, I'm going to say, you know what, I'm going to try to increase my hometown turnout because they're more likely to vote for me. So I'm going to call them and remind them to early vote. On the other hand, remember the 4s and 5s, they tend to vote not your way. I'm not going to ask them to vote. This only works if you're from one hometown and your opponent is from a different hometown. If you split your same hometown, you don't want to do that. Other groups that you want to early vote are your coalitions. For example, if you're head of the Chamber of Commerce and that group has been supporting you very heavily in this campaign, then you want to remind all your chamber friends and members to get out and early vote. If you're a member of the NRA, you want to remind your NRA members to get out and vote. You want to look for anything where your membership and you're more likely to win most of those votes. You want to remind those people to early vote. What if you haven't done enough voter ID work? Now, I don't recommend that. I told you from the beginning, I think that voter ID work starts on day 1. But what if your voter ID work has not been that great? You haven't done that much door knocking, you haven't been able to get many people on the phone survey, and you didn't have the money to do peer-to-peer texting. What do you do at that point? Well, what you can do is a poll. You can go and do a poll within your district and find out who are supporting you. And this is not the same thing as doing phone survey of identifying people. You're doing a poll. And what that poll is going to tell you is what groups are you winning. Are you winning men or are you winning women? What age groups are you winning? So say you're winning women that are over the age of 40. And you're winning that group by 60-40. Well, you want to kind of voter profile those people on your voter list and say, I'm going to turn out women over 40 because I'm winning them 60-40. And I know that the majority, a super majority of the people that I'm turning out are going to be my way. Now, I don't strongly recommend that, but sometimes that's what you have to do when you haven't done enough voter ID work. The next essential part of your GOTV plan is social pressure. What is social pressure? Did you ever get a letter from your utility company comparing how much electricity you use versus your neighbor? That letter, the utility company is trying to get you to conserve more electricity by guilting you, saying that you're using more than your neighbor. That's social pressure. Social pressure can now be applied to GOTV. It works better than the old saying, hey, it's going to be a tight race. Make sure you get out and vote. Now social pressure is telling somebody, hey, you voted in the last, you've only voted in the last 3 out of 5 elections. Make sure that you get your rate of voting up better. Do your civic duty. It is a way of guilting people to get them out to vote. And it can be done in 2 different methods, one through phone calls and the other way through mail. If you're doing it through the mail, usually what you do is you mail somebody a report card and you show them that they've only got a 70% rate for turning out to vote, whereas your neighbors have got 100%. You do that little comparison there. Sometimes you get some pushback from people, but it is all public record which elections people vote in, so don't worry about that. If you're calling people, you want to say, hey, your neighbors have all gotten out to vote. Are you going to do your civic duty? Now, social pressure can be done during the early voting. I like to, if I have the money on the campaign, I will do social pressure. I will start my social pressure program early during the early voting, saying that encouraging that other people are getting out to vote. Did you know that 7 out of the 10 of your neighbors have already early voted? Can you join those neighbors? Blah, blah, blah. And so I will do that with phone calls. I'll also do a postcard. But if my campaign is a poorer campaign, then I will hopefully be working my phones to get people out to early vote. But if I have to on the mailing, I will wait till right before the election day to get out that social pressure, the last ditch effort to get people out to vote. But overall, social pressure can really, it changes the way you talk to people, but it can encourage more people to go out and vote, to do their civic duty. I would strongly encourage you to do social pressure in your GOTV plan. I would strongly encourage you to use text messaging as part of your GOTV plan. 92% of people read their text messages. You can't get 92% of people to agree on what day of the week it is. Never mind get them to read their emails or answer their phones or answer their doors. So text messaging can get a message directly to the voter and get them to read it. That's essential, especially when you're trying to turn people out to vote. However, text messaging can be tricky. The FCC controls text messaging. You have to abide by their rules. One of the things for our campaigns that we do internally is we will get a text messaging system where we say text the following word to us if you want to be part of our campaign. And we put it on our website, we put it on our palm cards, we put it everywhere we can, we put it on our lawn signs. So we're encouraging people to proactively text us because we cannot contact that voter via text messaging without them contacting us. You might remember President Obama saying to everybody, hey, if you want to know who my vice presidential pick is going to be, text me a message to this number. That way he collected all of these text numbers so on election day he could text a message back to these people. That's one way of collecting text messaging numbers. There's also a new way called peer-to-peer texting. And in order to do this, you need to hire a vendor. And what you do is once you hire a vendor, you hand over your identified voter list. So these are the people you want to turn out, and you hand that over to your vendor and they match it to cell phones. Then you work out a message with that vendor on your GOTV. So you want to make sure, if you want to remind them to early vote, you work out an early voting message. Hey, did you know it was open? That the polls are open for between these days up until this time at night, reminding your voters that they can early vote. You can also do this on election day. But this peer-to-peer texting, you cannot do it internally. You have to use a vendor. Whereas your other ones where you've gotten them to proactively text message you, you can contact them. Now, I have to tell you, there's nothing better than when somebody's driving home on election day at 4 o'clock and they get a text message from you of them to remind them to go and vote, It really works well. 92% of people are going to read them. And remember, for the average person out there, they care more about what's happening with their sports team than they do about what's happening on election day. So this is why text messaging is so helpful. It cuts through the clutter, reminding people to get out there and vote. And that's the whole purpose of a GOTV plan. The last part of your GOTV plan is your election day plan. But that's a little bit of a misnomer. It's actually the 72-hour plan. You can't wait till election day to start this. Now you might think 72 hours of GOTV after you've just done early voting, that might be a little bit of overkill. Well, I'm telling you, if at 7 o'clock on election day, you're not getting voters kind of mad at you because you called them too much, then you haven't done your job. You want people, remember, election day is your going out of business, it's your fire sale. So if you happen to call people a little too much to remind them to vote, that's okay. Because you're not asking them to vote for you on Wednesday, you got to get them out to vote for you on Tuesday. So what are you going to do for those last 72 hours? Well, you want to start the calls. You want to be calling people all during them. You want to make sure that they are getting calls, that they're getting 2 pieces of mail at least, reminder cards to get out there and vote, and hopefully you're able to pay for some social pressure cards. You want to make sure that you're getting emails out. You know, your donors have emails, your volunteers have emails. Anybody you have an email for, they need to be getting emails to remind them to vote. If you are a Republican, I like talk radio. I'm trying to get my candidate onto talk radio to remind people to get out and to vote, or getting commercials onto that talk radio to remind people to get out and vote. Should you do web banners? If I'm running for a state rep or state senate district, my hometown has a newspaper and I want to increase the turnout of my hometown because I know I'm going to win it big, I might do banner ads on that newspaper's website. You definitely want to do Facebook ads to all of your friends on Facebook. So you want to create a universe and advertise to them with a reminder, hey, election day is coming up, make sure you vote tomorrow, make sure you vote on Tuesday, getting that message out to them. Most crucial part are phones. You need to have, whether it's paid phone banks or volunteer phone banks, you have to have phones. Now at some point you're going to have to make a decision. Do you have enough volunteers to call your entire voter ID list? Many times you don't, so you might have to do robocalls. And then you have to figure out, okay, every other campaign is doing robocalls. How do I cut through the clutter with robocalls? At this point, I usually think of different ways to use my robocalls. Is it the candidate's spouse making the call? Or, you know, I've had Pat Boone do calls, doing some voice that's different, that cuts through the clutter. The best calls, though, are volunteer calls. People like getting calls from volunteers, and they are more likely to turn out to vote if they get a call from a volunteer. But make sure you have a good script, and I like to always put a little bit of social pressure in there. If you've got enough volunteers, door-to-door works well, too. 13% of voters are more likely to get out and vote if they've had somebody knock on their door on election day. And then finally, remember, you want to text them. 92% of people read their text messages. So how does your 72-hour plan go? Well, I like to have a volunteer meeting on Sunday to go over what we need to get done with all of our volunteers, kind of charging them up. And then what we do is obviously we do calls and doors on on that Sunday. On that Monday, we're doing a drop. We might put out on that Sunday and Monday, we might be putting out flyers like this. Remember to vote, but these are only going to the people that we've identified for us. So we're doing a drop door to door, and it's got a little door hanger. We're also on Monday finalizing our list for our poll checkers. So if we're going to have people that are watching the polls, we need to make sure that they have a list of identified voters and making sure that it either works with their cell phones or they have a hard copy. I try to make sure that they have both the cell phone and the hard copy, just in case anything fails. And then Monday, we're doing evening calls. We're also posting, if you are allowed to, posting signs at the polls. Now, people will ask me, do you hold a rally or don't you hold a rally? Well, if I am, if I'm a Republican and I'm in a Republican majority district, I want to increase turnout overall because, look, if it tends to vote Republican and I'm a Republican, I want to hold a rally. I want to get in the news. I want to encourage turnout. If, on the other hand, I'm a Democrat and I'm in the minority, I don't want to do a rally. I want to do more sophisticated, doing my phone calls and doing my door knocking and spending my effort on that. I don't want to be in the media reminding Republicans to vote if I'm a Democrat. Tuesday, what do you do on Tuesday? Well, first, I have a very early meeting with my volunteers, usually around 5 a.m. Why would you ever want to have a meeting that early with your volunteers? Well, for your poll checkers, you need to make sure that they're going to show up. So many times there's something happens between Monday night and the next day. Somebody gets a flat tire, something happens. You need to make sure your poll checkers are showing up. So the best way to make sure they're showing up is having a meeting first thing in the morning, and you're passing out the poll checking list to them. And you're going through the rules with them once again on, what they can and cannot do as poll checkers. But I have that meeting first thing in the morning. So if somebody doesn't show up, I've got other volunteers that I put into their place. This is very important. Sign holding on election day, I consider calls far more important than sign holding, unless it's a presidential election. As we talked about earlier, 10% of people make up their minds on the lower tiered races on election day. So if I'm in a presidential camp, it's a presidential year, I want to make sure that I've got sign holders there for my lower tiered races. If not, I want to put those sign holder people on phones. Now, there are some people that refuse to do the phone calls, so I will put them out sign holding, but that is not my first priority most of the time. Calls are always most important. When do you start your calls? 10 a.m. Do not be calling people at 8 a.m. or 7 a.m. You're really going to tick them off. So I start calls at 10 a.m. along with my door knocking if I have enough volunteers. I also want to make sure that I have volunteers who can do rides to the polls. When you're doing calls, often you'll find voters who cannot get to the polls on their own. So you send over a volunteer and give them a ride to the poll. Hey, you don't want to leave that voter stranded at home that you know is going to vote your way. I also make sure that I have, once again, the lawyers on hand. I check in with them, and in case there's a problem, I have those lawyers on hand. Make sure that there's no problems with the ballots. I even sometimes like to send them at the close of the night to the election polling places to make sure that the ballots are secured and that there's no funny business. At 4 p.m., I have my volunteers doing the poll checking. We can do it if we're doing real-time updates through our cell phones. We really don't need them to report in, but if they're doing paper copies, I have them come back in with their paper copies, and we now start calling everybody who hasn't shown up to vote. And we are relentless at that point, whether it's robocalls or whether it's live calls, we are relentless. And I know at 7 o'clock that night, people are going to be upset, but you have to get them out to vote. Also at 4 o'clock is when I'm starting to text message. Because I want that last minute text message as people are driving home or picking up their kids from school to remind them to get out there and vote. And then the last thing I do on election day is making sure that my poll checkers are at the places where they secure the ballots to make sure that they are locked up and that there's no funny business. Now, most people will say, well, what about a party? I really don't. I personally don't care about a party, an election night party, because it doesn't make a difference in your GOTV. It's great to have everybody get together, but some of my best races, we didn't even have an election party, and we won because we put everything into our GOTV calls. And so, you know, a party doesn't really matter. A party will happen no matter what if you win. So if your GOTV is doing well, the party will happen. If your GOTV is not doing well, there's not going to be a party. I can't stress to you enough, and I hope you've enjoyed this video about GOTV. It is a crucial part of your campaign plan. And all too often, campaigns either do it at the end or don't save enough money and can't do their GOTV, and then they lose. If you start from day one putting your GOTV plan into place, you are increasing your chances for winning. Don't leave your election results up to fate. Do your GOTV. If you ever have any questions about it, you can email me, Holly@msn.com. Thank you for watching.